to a special bonus crossover episode of Historical Happy Hour. Today, I'm so happy to be here with best-selling British novelist Kate Thompson, who is also the host of the very popular podcast From the Library with Love. The format today is a little different, as we'll be interviewing each other about all things historical fiction and writing. And so excited. We were talking so much we had to hit record because we had like so much to share. So welcome, Kate, and thank you so much for doing
Thank
this.
you,
This is so
Jane.
cool.
No, my pleasure, and thank you. I should be saying I think this is a first, isn't it, where two podcasts meet
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And
and have a
maybe we
first
can do this
date.
again. Yeah, absolutely. So good. So,
Oh no, it's
okay,
great.
so I'm going to jump in with questions, and then we're going to go
Sure,
back and forth with questions, and then talk about, share some questions and talk about our craft and process towards the end. So
sounds good
we
to
both
me.
had World War II books come out around the same time, 2024, right?
Yes,
Is
that's
that
right. Yeah.
the Wartime Book Club was yours, and it takes place on the island of Jersey during its occupation during World War II. I loved the story. I
Oh,
loved the
bless you. Thank you.
premise. Yeah, and I love the fascinating history. So talk about this book and the
Oh.
premise and how you ended up writing about it.
Yeah. So, yeah, the Wartime Book Club. So, as you rightly pointed out, it's set during the occupation of the Channel Islands by German forces. And for those that don't know or haven't read wait for it, the Guernsey Literary Potato Peel Pie Society, that mouthful, which most people have, to be fair. So most people, I guess, will be aware that the Channel Islands were the only British territory to be occupied during World War II. So in essence, what I've got is two protagonists who didn't have to endure the Blitz and the rockets and so forth, but they did have to live under the heel of the Nazi jackboot. And I've long been intrigued by the Channel Islands occupation. All my previous novels are set in the East End of London, so I kind of geographically hopped over the water. And I have two very different protagonists. I have Grace, who works in St Helier Library and who is utterly enraged at the censorship of the heavy-handed censorship of her stock by German forces, starts hiding books and sneaking them to people that the Germans deem as Untermensch, so sort of Jewish families in hiding. And then my second protagonist, B, who works in the post office, who is equally incensed at the betrayal of her fellow islanders who start to write informers' letters. She begins to steam open the letters in order to warn people who have been denounced. So you've got two different, very different forms of resistance, two very different characters. And I think what underpins it all, Jane, is just this need to want to understand the kind of moral quagmire of living alongside the enemy, but also really what is the backbone of the book, I suppose, is exploring the joy and the solace and the sanctuary of a wartime book club. You know, reading with friends in the darkest of times. As one islander said to me, Kate, you know, reading was our only true form of intellectual freedom. And the island became a spiritual food store. And so the minute he said that to me, I thought, yeah, bingo, that's it. I have to set a novel there in Jersey. So yeah, that's the kind of themes and the essence of the book, Jane.
So good. And I was immediately thinking of the Guernsey Literary and Potato Peel Society when
Yeah,
I read it,
yeah.
because I love the
Well, who
book.
would?
I love the movie. Did you like the movie?
Oh my God, it's one of those rare things where I loved the movie almost as much, if not more, than the book. It was so good, wasn't it?
So good. Yes, yeah, they did a great job.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And on the subject of movies, you know, I was reading about your latest book, Goodnight from Paris, which I believe came out earlier this year as well. Is that right?
Yes, it came out. I'm sorry, it came out a year ago, a
A
little
year
over
ago,
a year
yeah,
ago. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
But wow, what a premise. And that to me felt very cinematic as well. And of course, as soon as I started reading about this, I immediately Googled her and I think, is this real? Was there this American film star? And I was stunned to discover this extraordinary woman's life, you know, her role in the resistance, her broadcast to America, her internment in the monkey house of a zoo, and her escape. I was like, this is crazy. And reading it, I was reminded that nothing is stranger than the truth. How did you uncover this remarkable woman and breathe life into her story?
yeah. So the woman's name is Drue Leyton, and when I was my third novel, the Secret Stealers was about the women of the OSS, the precursor to the CIA in World War II, and some of them were like undercover agents in on the continent of Europe and in Asia. And so when I was doing that research, I came across this story about how after excuse me, I'm going to press do not disturb so I don't get any more beeps. Um, After World War II, after Pearl Harbor, after Americans entered the war, um, several months later, in France, the Germans, France was occupied at the time. The Germans rounded up all the American women they could find in and around Paris and the surrounding villages, and they rounded up several hundred, and they arrested them all. They put them on buses, and they imprisoned them in a zoo outside of Paris, and specifically in the monkey house. And their friends and family had to pay
Wow.
5 francs to like pay to go see them and shout over the fence at them and bring them supplies. And
No.
it was wild. And one of the women was actually Sylvia Beach, who was the owner of
Of
Shakespeare and
course.
Company,
Yeah,
American.
yeah.
And another was Drue Leyton, who I'd never heard of before. Never, didn't know anything about her story, and she came up a couple times in this monkey house story that I kept coming across. And first of all, I mean, like when you hear a story like that, you're like, surely someone has written a novel about this because it's so
Yeah,
wild
yeah.
and stranger
Yeah.
than fiction. Um, but I couldn't find any, and I decided that Drue's story was the most interesting out of a lot of the women that I read about who were in the monkey house, and
Mm,
then went on to
mm.
another camp in the mountains. It was a town called Vittel in the mountains of France. Drue was a 1930s Hollywood actress, stunningly beautiful, looked very much kind of the old Hollywood part. If you look her up online, she fell head over heels with a Frenchman named Jacques Tartier. And in 1939, they got married and moved to Paris, right as things were getting bad in France. And he went off to war, and she ended up she had this whole evolution during the war. She left acting and ended up becoming the voice of America, essentially the first voice of America broadcasting to an American audience about what
Mm.
was happening in on the continent of Europe during the war. And she became so good at that job that the Nazis actually put a bounty on her head and started broadcasting that they would, once they occupied France, they would execute her. And they did this several times. They announced it on their Berlin radio, and she still kept broadcasting.
This
And then
takes
after
enormous bravery,
it,
doesn't it?
enormous bravery, and then after that, when France was finally occupied, she ended up becoming part of this underground network that was rescuing Allied flyers that were crashing all over the country at that point, and getting them out of the country. Getting them papers, getting them money, getting change of clothes, and getting them out of the country safely. So her life took just this whole different
Mm.
trajectory because of the war, and I just loved her story so much. So
How
that's why I ended up
extraordinary.
writing it.
But doesn't
Yeah,
it show
yeah.
as well what we're really capable of? You know, she was obviously a glamorous woman, an actress, destined for sort of stardom and fame. And yet, I suppose we don't know what we're capable of and that strength until it's tempered in the fires of war, I suppose.
I think that's so true, and I think that was one of the things that I think they're similar to your book. I was reading, you talked about Bee and Grace and
Mm.
the brave choices that they made and the quieter forms of resistance. So, talk about how you developed these two characters, and
Mm.
are they
Yeah.
based directly on anyone in your research?
So you and I were chatting a little bit about this before we came on air. I'm very happy and in my comfort zone researching. So, if I could do nothing but go out and interview our wartime generation, go to archives and libraries, read books, then that would be I'd be a very happy bunny if I never actually had to write a single word. So the characterization is that's the bit where I feel like I'm still learning my craft when it comes to that. So my characters are yes, they're always based on real people that I've met, but not solely just I couldn't just say that B or Grace is all just one person. They're more like an amalgamation of various different people I've met. I think as writers we're a little bit like magpies, aren't we? Swooping around, picking up anything that glimmers that's gold and then, working that into our characters. So yeah, so characterization is something that is ongoing with me. But I heard a very interesting interview the other day with Jojo Moyes, who obviously everybody will have heard of from Me Before
Mhm.
You and Giver of Stars. And she had a wonderful and she her characters are so strong. And she had a wonderful piece of advice, which is that you have to, in order to make your characters real, fully fleshed out, people that, that other people can resonate with, you have to almost stress test them. You have to understand where they're coming from and who they are. So at any given point, you have to say to yourself, what's in my character? What would be in Grace's handbag? If B was walking down the street and she saw a stranger kick a dog, what would she do? So put them in situations that occur outside of your novel. And then you begin to really get to know them better. And I really took that advice on board, and I do that now with my characters. So I just sort of come up with their backstory. I live and breathe them. I try to think of what they do outside of the book until they become real people to me. And I think unless they feel real to me, they're not going to feel real to anybody else. Does that make sense?
That makes complete sense. I absolutely agree with you. And
Yeah.
it's funny, I have a subscription to BBC Maestro, and so I took the course
Oh,
that
really?
Jojo
Oh,
Moyes
did
did, this
you?
whole
Did you do
course.
that? I
Yeah,
was thinking about that. Was it good?
it was so good. Yeah, and
Oh,
she
wow.
offered some of that exact advice, and I am more of a fan of her now than I was before.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
same, same. Jane, I'm really sorry. Is it all right just to pause for a minute? My dog is going absolutely mental downstairs, and I know she's got herself locked. We're on the river and we've got a jetty, and she's pushed the gate open and she's trapped on the jetty, and I can
Oh
hear
no!
her crying and howling.
Go get
I was hoping you could. I'm so sorry. I'll be 1 minute. Is it
I will
okay? And then
pause.
your husband can edit it out.
Oh yeah, we'll figure it out. Actually, and my daughter keeps texting me. I got to tell her to stop. So
I'm going to be very, very quick. Um, so Jane, I was looking through your website eagerly, and of all of your books, I found myself most drawn to the Saturday Evening Girls Club, which I believe is about the lives of four young immigrant women living in Boston in the early 1900s, escaping tradition and the confines of the life that society has set out for them. And I was thinking to myself, why am I drawn to this? I've ordered it, so I can't wait to read it. But I think it's because I just seem to return to female friendships again and again, whether I'm writing about them myself or whether I'm reading them. And I think that there's so much power and solace in those relationships. And I really believe that female friendships are sort of amongst the greatest romances almost that we have in our lives. What drew you to this subject for your debut novel?
yeah, well, thank you, and thank you for ordering it. That it came out in 2017, and your debut is like it's like your baby book, right?
It
It's
is.
such a big deal. Yeah, it was
Oh, for
life
sure.
changing. Yeah. So I was a freelance writer, like a lot of authors, and I had written an article about this pottery, this antique pottery that's really collectible now, called the Saturday Evening Girls Club pottery,
Oh, that's actually what
and
it's called.
it's actually what it's called. It's also
Oh,
sometimes
wow.
called Paul Revere pottery, because it was
Wow.
the Saturday Evening Girls Club was like directly across from the Old North Church in Boston. And so I read about the pottery, and then I read about these young women, and this is early 1900s. They were Italian and Jewish immigrants, and they were poor. They had their life was very tough in Boston's North End back then, and yet they really, through this club, were able to kind of rise above their station, and with supporting each other. And the founders of the club, one of them was a librarian, Edith Gruyere. Another one was Helen Starrow. We have Starrow Drive in Boston. She was from a very wealthy family, but she supported these girls. She helped them, some of them, go to college, actually.
Mhm.
Um, and and I was just really charmed too, because they were all kind of first generation, born in America.
Right.
Their parents couldn't speak each other's languages, but they were all American, and so like the kind of
Oh,
cross
wow.
cultural friendships were really interesting between these Italian
Yeah.
girls and these Jewish girls. And yeah, that story is like a quieter story, and it's really about their friendships, and how
Mm.
that club and the friendships that they found in that club helped them have better lives,
I
despite the
love
time.
that premise. I love that
Yeah,
premise. The idea of these women, making and creating pots together and ostensibly not having much in common because they're from very different cultural backgrounds, and yet they have the main thing they have in common is they're first generation immigrants and that they
yes.
are raised together as Americans. What a fascinating concept.
Yeah, yeah, and I encourage you to look on eBay at the Saturday Evening Girls Club pottery, because
I'm gonna.
the pieces are worth like thousands of dollars now. Like, they're
No,
really highly
really.
collectible, and it's just I have one piece my husband gave me when the book came out, and
Oh, really?
a couple little broken pieces I got on eBay that like were put together to show and tell when I do
Yeah.
talks and stuff. But yeah, it's fun. It's really fun to look
Isn't this
at what they
amazing
were.
thing about podcasting? I have never heard of the Saturday Evening Girls Club pottery or anything. So that is immediately when we get off, that's the first thing I'm going to do because I love
Yeah.
pottery. To
Oh, you
me,
do?
that's
Yeah.
just a yeah, yeah.
It,
I actually began learning to do some pottery myself, like as a sort of antidote to the stress of writing. Doing work in the potter's kiln and so forth, and it's lovely.
cool.
It's just
Yeah.
incredible to do. So yeah, I think
Oh,
maybe
very
that's why
cool.
I'm subconsciously drawn to it.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, I hope let me know how you enjoy, if you enjoy this story. Thank you
Oh,
so
I'm gonna.
much.
Oh,
Yeah,
you're
yeah.
welcome.
So I wanted to ask you because
Mm.
I think we're both total research nerds and love, and
Yeah.
and your notes on the in the back of the Wartime Book Club, like astonishing research notes in the back,
They're almost as
and
long
the
as the novel.
oh, I loved it though. I loved it so much, and I was like, oh my gosh, you did so much research, and
Too much,
it's so.
but
I'm
yeah.
so glad you put so much of it in the back notes because it gives you context for what was real and who things were, storylines that were based on real
Yeah.
people, and it was amazing. So talk about your research process for this book, and
Yeah. So firstly, I've just started doing that more and more now, even though, as my editor pointed out, my God, Kate, there's so much content at the back, it's almost equal in weight to the actual narrative of the story. But I kind of got away with it because I said to her, look, I get all these emails from people and they all say the same thing that they like the book, but they loved the information at the end. And I think people like getting a peek behind the scenes, the story behind the story, the glimpse at the process, and also like, knowing what you did and who you interviewed and what what's based on real people and what isn't. So I did. So with this particular book, obviously I'm not from Jersey. So whereas my previous books I could just get on a train to the East End of London, here I couldn't. So I had to be a bit more meticulous in my planning. So and then of course COVID interrupted it. So in the end I went to the island 5 times, and I would try and ram those info, because it's like trying to get time away from the home and the family. So I would try and ram those trips and fill them as many interviews as possible. So I did the usual things. I went to the archives, I interviewed historians, I went on local radio and put appeals in the local newspaper. But the most interesting form of research came when I quite often would turn up to Age UK, Age Concerned coffee mornings, um, and just sat and listened, spellbound to the wonderful back and forth memories and that unfiltered gush of social history that you only get when you sit in a room full of people that could remember the occupation. And I became acutely aware that every time I would come and I would interview somebody, on my next visit, somebody had passed away. And therefore, and I was thinking, God, that I had that last interview with them, and it was almost that sense of the past just crumbling before me. That there was a
mm,
wonderful a saying I heard that every time an older person dies, it's like a library burning down, and I really
oh,
had that in my mind when I was out there. And so, yeah, I just kind of was like a sponge, just running around the island, just interviewing as many wartime people as I could, and some islanders were suspicious about, in inverted commas, what sort of book I was writing. I think they were fearful that it would oversimplify or focus on the very clumsy and tired kind of collaboration narrative. Um, there was only one woman, quite interestingly, who I interviewed, or I was trying to interview. She heard me ask a question about Silvertide, which is the headquarters of the German secret field police. And she said, oh, I've got a good story to tell you about that. Come to my home tomorrow. So, curiosity piqued. I went along the next day and she opened the door a crack and she said, I'm really sorry, I've changed my mind. You can go away and forget what I've told you, but I will have to live with it all over again, going round and round my head. And and the
oh,
door closed in my head, and I kind of walked away deeply saddened at her turmoil, because sometimes it's not the stories you hear, it's the stories you don't hear that come to have an influence on you. And so really the takeaway from it was just that go out and interview those people, because the window of opportunity is closing all the time to capture those unique, remarkable kind of stories. And I definitely got the feeling that, especially in Jersey, where the occupation is such a volatile, contentious, difficult subject. For 5.5 years they lived alongside the enemy. They were called collaborators at the end of the war by the British government even. So there's a lot of suspicion anger, and occupations inject poison into the areas that have lived through them. But I got the feeling that, nearly next year will be 80 years since the end of liberation, that the need to share is overcoming the desire to forget. And that
Hmm.
Jersey is an island just simmering with stories. You can almost feel it bubbling in the air. And so that's what kind of kept me going back and back. I mean, I probably should have stopped at 3 research trips. Financially, I definitely should have stopped at three, 3 research trips. I think I have a feeling, Jane, you'd have been the same as me. I just kept boarding that plane and going back, and each time I went back, I was rewarded with more stories. And yeah, I love it. I just love interviewing our wartime generation. The more you listen, the more you hear. I feel. Do you get a sense of that? Because your book's all set World War II as well.
I do, and I think that one of the reasons I'm drawn to it is because we're losing that generation, and I think that's why a lot of other people are drawn to the stories as
Yeah,
well.
yeah,
You
yeah.
know,
Must be.
we're starting to lose that direct connection to that history because that whole generation is passing. I mean, you saw the
Yeah,
D-Day celebrations,
I
and it was
know.
so moving, like
So
seeing
moving, wasn't it?
oh my gosh, these old men who are like their stories were all incredible, and there's not many of
Yeah.
them left anymore. So,
This is it.
so
This is
yeah, yeah.
exactly it. This is exactly it. And I'm always aware when I go into an interview with somebody, and you never know where the conversation is going to go. But suddenly the past isn't kind of dusty or dry or sealed off behind a door. It's bright and real and fantastically vivid. And I really took a piece of advice. Actually, I interviewed Heather Morris, who obviously wrote The Tattooist of Auschwitz, who
Hmm.
about her book for the podcast, and she said to me, active listening is a skill. And I really took that on board. And actually, I'd take it a little bit further. I'd say it's an art form. And I'm constantly reminding myself when I go out and interview that generation to listen more. And instead of thinking, what would I like to add to the conversation, or what would I say, I just try to listen with, open ears and an open heart, because it doesn't, you will always learn things about the war. And that was definitely the case in, especially with the Jersey book, as people began to kind of, those stories began to leak out, and you really got a sense of what it was, the horror and the privation and the fear and the desperation of living under that Nazi jackboot, like I said. So that was there was no, I'm not very organized with it, Jenny, if I'm honest. I just sort of turn up and run around like a mad thing, running around the island, just doing as many different interviews as I can and knocking on doors. But it's so rewarding. It's the huge joy of the job.
Oh yeah, and
And of course, it's a great procrastination tool, isn't it? Because while you're
it,
researching, you're not writing.
it's a huge procrastination, and I mean, what a beautiful place to visit too. By the way,
Oh,
like
it was no hardship. It was no hardship at all. I mean, look, honestly, it's a beautiful. I mean, it's only tiny Jersey, but it's soaked in sunshine a lot, and it's got the most beautiful countryside and beaches, and so yeah, there was no problem there.
yeah, no, I was thinking too when I was reading it, how that their experience was very unique to Europeans. I mean, the whole, the UK, London, they had the Blitz, and the continent of Europe had their own troubles. But Jersey's experience with the occupation, with living with
Yeah,
those Germans for years, I didn't. I mean, I guess in the back of my mind, I knew that. But then when you read about it, you're like, my God, how did they get
yeah.
through it? It's unbelievable.
It is unbelievable. I mean, and how did they get through it? And I think people are quite often shocked when they read the Wartime Book Club. I have people getting in touch saying, "I didn't know it was that bad." And I think they were starving. Islanders from
Yeah.
after D-Day, and their supplies from St Malo were cut off. And before the SS Vega arrived, which is a Red Cross ship which brought rations, eventually on New Year's Day, 1945. So there was 6 months where people were dying of starvation, malnutrition, disease. People that couldn't get insulin were dying, diabetics were dying. So we tend to think of the war, oh well, there was no bombs, there was no active combat, and that's true, there was no fighting, but people died constantly from those things. One woman I interviewed told me that she said halfway, during the siege, her pet dog Beauty went missing, and the Germans had shot the dog and eaten it. I mean, that even
Ugh,
the Germans were starving as well, because they were cut off, so they were seen shooting seagulls and eating them,
ugh.
and that, so those sort of horrifying aspects, as well as this sense of, again, we don't think of the Channel Islands as something connected to the Holocaust, to the camps, to the horror of what was happening on the
Right.
continent. But, there were islanders who were deported, as I've mentioned within my book, a lady, a real woman called Louisa Gould, who was caught sheltering a Russian slave and was deported to France and died in Ravensbrück. So that's another untold story, I think. I think, really we look at the Channel Islands and we think, oh well, it was just an easy occupation. It was anything but. They were
Mm.
subject to the same horrifying conditions that a lot of people in France and mainland Europe were as well. So I really tried to explore that within the book as well.
Oh, and you absolutely did. Yeah, yeah, just
Thank you.
unbelievable.
Yeah. And I have a question for you, Jane, because we're talking about, and you said about being acutely aware of that generation leaving us. I noticed on your website you mentioned that you're drawn to it because your grandfather was in World War II. Are you happy to share something of that with me?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So he passed away over 20 years ago now, but I was very close with him growing up, and but like a lot of that generation, he was very quiet about his experiences there. He was a firefighter on the Navy ships off the coast of
Really?
Africa. Yeah, off the coast of Africa and Europe
Wow.
during the war, and he just I try to get it out of him, but he was very very private. And the interesting thing here, this is an interesting story. So we always thought that he was stationed off of Normandy or that area of France, and I didn't know much else about it after he passed away. And for my parents' 40th anniversary 15 years ago, we went to the south of France for like a family trip. My daughters, my husband and I, my folks, and we stayed in Nice, but I was obsessed with going to this village, Villefranche-sur-Mer, which is like
I've heard of
15
it.
minutes
Yeah.
away. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and just obsessed. I just like had read about it, and I'm like, I want to go there. So we had the best day trip there, and my dad loved it so much that we bought him a little painting off the street, like one of those guys doing the little watercolors, and
Yeah.
gave it to him when he went back. And then a month after we returned from that trip, my dad found some old letters and from my grandfather, and learned that he had been stationed off of Villefranche-sur-Mer
No.
during the war.
No.
Um,
So you were
yeah,
drawn to it.
yeah, yeah. So I thought that that was really a weird, like really odd coincidence that I would like felt so compelled
Oh,
to go there.
I'd call that serendipity, like you just
Yeah, yeah.
drawn to it. What was his name?
Joseph Healy. Yeah.
Joseph Healey. Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, he might have known my grandfather who was, in the Royal Navy as well, the British
Oh
Royal Navy.
wow.
So yeah, yeah.
Oh
So
no way. Oh,
I know,
that's
and
funny.
like your grandfather, he was I didn't know him actually, but, by all accounts, he was a very quiet, withdrawn man. He hardly said a word. And it wasn't really
Yeah.
till after that I found out that he had been a submariner in World War One on a submarine. I mean, he was only a boy, he can't have been much
Oh
out of the short trousers. And he
yeah.
survived the Battle of Jutland, which was a terrible loss of life. He must have seen thousands of his crewmates drowned. And the awful thing of that was that, then after the World War One, he gets married, he has children, and by the time of World War Two, he's still young enough to be
Oh
drafted to that. So he's back into the Royal Navy by the time of the Second World War, and now he's commander of Plymouth Harbour, which was heavily bombed, and he was responsible
yes.
for that. So he never really said much about it after the war, and I wonder now, in reflection, when I'm going out and interviewing all these wartime, our wartime generation, and I one thing I've become to understand quite clearly is that obviously most of that generation must have had PTSD.
Oh
There was
yeah.
no acknowledgement, was there, of their suffering or so forth. And so instead they just suffered in silence. And I just think that pain, it doesn't fade, but it festers. And I just wonder whether my writing is an attempt to make sense of my own, his suffering, and perhaps to understand my own family history. And because I can't explain it more than that. I'm just drawn to it in a
Yeah.
very deep, visceral way that maybe perhaps you are too. And so this is why we do what we do, maybe.
I
What do you
think
think?
that's definitely part of it. I think that after I finally, 10 years got the Saturday and the Girls Club published, like in the
Mm,
back of my mind, I'd always been like, I want to write a World War II story. I have to, like that. I'm just like so drawn to that history, I think, because of my
yeah,
own history with my grandfather. And it's funny,
yeah.
like, when Saving Private Ryan came out, he was still alive. And my father was like, Dad, do you want to go? I will take you, because a lot of veterans were going to see it, and he was like, nope, I lived it.
Really?
I don't need to
I
see
don't wanna
that,
see it
you know?
again. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
I'm good.
Isn't
So,
yeah, isn't it so interesting that the reactions I often think like I was interviewing a woman who had lived through the Blitz, and in fact she was buried alive when
oh,
in an Anderson shelter, and she said to me that no matter what happens she will never go to bed at night without checking the kettle is full of water, so that if they get bombed in the night she and the standpipes and all the water runs out, she knows she can always have a cup of tea in the morning. And she said, I know it sounds silly, but for 80 years she's done that, and wherever she sits she has to make sure she's near a door or she knows where the exit is. She's very sort of claustrophobic, understandably, after that. So
understandably.
I think the legacy is so deep in a way that we can't even truly understand.
Yeah, I completely agree. Yeah. Do you want to talk a little bit about writing process
Yes,
stuff?
shall we? Shall we?
Yeah.
I feel like we should.
Yes,
People are
yeah.
always interested, aren't they?
They
So come
are.
on,
So,
let's talk process.
uh,
Are you a plotter, would you say, or a pantster, as they say?
I am very much a plotter. I really, and that,
Oh,
yeah, I'm not, that's not to say, like, so I kind of plot out beginning to end how I think the story's going to go. But then, like, every 4 or 5 chapters when I'm drafting, I'm like, okay, am I still on track? Is this still going to, is this still going the way? Do I need to tweak things? Is this still making sense? Is it holding together? So
yeah.
yeah, I'm a plotter, but that doesn't say I definitely sort of deviate sometimes as I go.
Yeah. I think I'm kind of the same, but I try not to be too deeply embedded within it. So I have a historical timeline that I stay quite faithful to in terms of when
Yeah,
things happen. And then I know my beginning, my middle, and my end. I know my narrative arc. I know in advance the journey that I want my characters to go on. But then contained within that, I think you've got to allow space for the magic to happen and for your characters to breathe and for your characters to get off the page and do something that surprises you. And I think that's where the sort of those moments of magic can happen. So I don't want to sort of almost like plot myself into a corner. And I
yes.
can't when I see people that have got post-it notes everywhere and very detailed mind maps and whiteboards filled with, oh my God, it makes me feel nervous. I just think I couldn't do that. I loose
Yeah, I don't.
structure, I guess.
I get very stressed out when I see those as well. I'm like, I don't understand that level at
Yeah.
all.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
That's too much for me, I'd say.
And
And
then
what
so, oh, go ahead.
no, no, you please, you go first. This is what happens when
No,
we get two podcasters interviewing each
that's
other.
right. That's right. So, so what, you've been doing this for a while. Like, what, I'm sure people would ask you about writing advice, publishing advice. Those are two different
Oh,
things. What's the
oh.
best advice you can give?
Oh gosh, that question feels so enormous, doesn't it?
It is. Yeah.
I think I think in terms of getting published, the old advice of never giving up is true, and I think it's such a difficult business, isn't it? And I think you have to develop quite a thick skin. And if one agent turns you down, then you just keep going. Because, if one thing I've learned over the years is that everything is circular and, everything is subject to trends and genre. And just because one person doesn't like it doesn't mean to say in 5 years' time they'll love it. You just have to have that self belief and keep going. And really, the best tips, I think, are the best way to make yourself a better writer is to become a better reader, if that makes sense. I
Hmm.
try to fill my life with books. I've always got multiple books on the go, whether I'm reading nonfiction as research. I've got a huge stack of books next to my bedside table. When I'm in the car or I'm peeling potatoes or chopping onions, I'm listening to books. I'm just a voracious reader, and I always have my mind tuned for the sentence or the prose or the description that stops me in my tracks, that stands out to me. And I think to myself, what was it as a reader that I loved so much about that? What made me love that book? And I try to attune my brain to be aware of it. What stops me in my tracks with a book? And I think lastly, and then I'd love to hear your tips, I think it's really helpful to get to know yourself as a writer and what your authentic voice is. What are you bringing that's unique? But also be aware of the traps and the tropes that you tend to fall into. Like I know that I spend too long researching, and therefore there's a tendency to want to like sort of information dump on the page. And I became aware of this actually when through a review, which I know you're not supposed to read reviews, but actually I say do read your reviews because you learn a lot about yourself as a writer if you can set
Hmm.
aside your ego and think, actually, maybe what they're saying is right. Because this one woman had put, oh, Thompson's done her research. And I thought, oh, thanks. That's nice. And then she put, and doesn't she want us to know it? And I was like, oh, ouch.
Ouch.
Yeah. But what I took away from that, I guess what I learned is that they're a delicate application of your history research, light brushstrokes as opposed to just a heavy coating. Sometimes you can say more with a sentence than reams and reams. So I try to keep that uppermost in my mind. And also that the story is the king. The story is it. If it's not
Yes.
serving the story, it can go. There's a lot of stuff in books that isn't actually related to the story. The story has to keep moving forward all the time. What about you, Jane?
Yes.
What would you say?
I could have said all of those things myself. Like, I completely
Yeah,
agree. One thing that I always say is, like, the history has to serve the story. Like, on the back of my mind. I'm always like, the
that's a
history
nice way
has
of
to
putting it.
serve the story.
Yeah.
Because I've been accused, especially with the first drafts of Saturday Evening Girls Club, my beta readers were like, nobody cares that much about how the pottery is made. You've got
I
like
mean, I
10
probably
pages.
would, but yeah.
Like, got to take out some of that. So, yeah,
Yeah,
things like
yeah.
that. So tell me, because I ask this question to every author I interview, and I think it's so tricky. How how do you strike a balance between fact and fiction in your storytelling? And are there any strict rules you adhere to?
Oh, that's such a good question. I don't think there is any strict rules that I adhere to. I try to take each individual book on its merits. And as I've developed as an author, I think I've become more confident about weaving in real stories and real people. It was something that I was always very nervous of to begin with. But
Hmm.
now, the Wartime Book Club, I've featured, as I said earlier, Louisa Gould, who was a real woman who was executed by the Nazis for her act of resistance. And so, walking that line between truth and fiction, this is a real woman who has real relatives and survive, and people that are alive today that will read this book and might not like my interpretation of Louisa Gould. So, in fact, I actually contacted her family members who told me very, very generously and magnanimously that they weren't proprietorial about history, that my version of Louisa Gould was just that, my own, provided I did my research. So that's what I do. I research, 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 and I try to keep in mind to be collaborative, um, share, and remain open to the feelings of others. And I think as authors, that's our duty of care that we have to act with emotional integrity. So always, I'm trying to kind of play that balancing act between weaving in the truth into a narrative that is then creative and still works for the story, works for the reader. It's still a story, right? So not to
Hmm.
be a slave to the facts as well. So it's that dance almost between the two, isn't it? But do you know what? I had a really good piece of writing advice from Christy Lefteri, who's the author of The Beekeeper of Aleppo. And she said to me, look, you can't always write what you know. She said, it's all about the connection and what's going on inside you. She said, you can't always write what you know. You have to write what you feel. It's the feel, not the know. And I really love
Hmm.
that because I thought, yeah, that makes sense to me. How do you feel about it, Jane? I mean,
It
because you
totally
write a
makes
lot
sense.
about real people in your books.
I do, but Drue Leyton, the Goodnight from Paris, she was the first main character protagonist that was a real person in history. So I was very nervous about that, and I also got in touch with her family. She has a granddaughter and a grandson, and they were very
Oh,
supportive, thank God. And they liked the book and the way she was portrayed, and I tried to honor her story as much as possible. But at the end of the day, this is fiction, and you have to insert scenes that are made up, and so that's tricky, especially when it's a real person in history. Like you said, they might have family still, but I think what you're saying is very true. I interviewed Kristen Hanna after when the woman came out a couple months
oh,
ago, and
God, I love that
she
book.
oh, so good, so good. And And she was amazing. And one thing she said that has stuck with me, that kind of, I think it gives you freedom as a fiction author. She said, in the beginning, she's written like 20, 30 books. She said in the beginning, I was very, very nervous about historical detail and dates and times and getting everything
Mm,
exact. And she said, but now I realize that it's more about getting the essence of the story, getting the history and the essence of the story right. It doesn't have to be, exact to the time and the date and the
yeah,
person, as long as you kind of get the essence of the
I
story
agree.
right.
I
Yeah.
agree. I think people forgive. I mean, it never very rarely happens that you get an inaccuracy in terms of dates and times. You're not writing a history book. You're writing
Right.
something people will emotionally connect to. And I felt maybe that's why we over research and why I went to Jersey 5 times and interviewed as many different wartime survivors as I could, because only actually through layering up those details, you get a much richer, more complex picture. And then you come to the page with the confidence that you do know what that essence is. And I
Hmm.
think it's
Hmm.
easier to fend off criticism if you've done a lot of research and you say, look, this is my opinion, so this is how I
Yes.
felt, have based off this kind of research.
Yeah,
So,
I think that's true. Yeah.
and it gives you
Um,
that confidence, doesn't it, to speak with some authority, I suppose, about that area. But I always keep in mind, I'm not a historian. I am a
Same.
journalist, but I'm a historical fiction writer.
Hmm. Yeah. And there's that creativity and that element of like, yes, you want to educate, but you also want to entertain and inspire. It's, yeah.
Yeah.
So,
And people come because they want to escape. They read. I mean, I know I do. I pick up a book or I press play on an Audible because I want to escape my life and enter another life for a short while. And so that's
yes,
what we're
yes,
supposed to be providing, not a detailed, chronological breakdown of historical events.
exactly. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
We're on the same page.
definitely. So, on that subject of historical fiction and versus nonfiction, what are you working on next, Jane? What's your next project? In fact, you have
So
one coming out next year, don't you?
I do. So, and that will be my next project for the summer, I think. So it's early Cold War. And I've been thinking about it since 2018. I read an article in the Smithsonian Magazine about this group of women code breakers in the late 1940s and 1950s. That they were young. They had moved to Washington. They had been recruited because they were, good at math and good at languages, and they all became very close friends. And they were the ones to break into the Russian telegrams during the war that identified all of these Russian spies that were, many of whom were still in the U.S. and had stolen nuclear secrets from the U.S. and including Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, among others. So it's about this group. It's a friendship story. There's a love story, but it's also about this extraordinary group. These women had to keep this a secret for the rest of their lives. They were, it was called the Venona Project, is what it was known as, and it wasn't declassified till the 1990s. So
Oh,
the
really?
things that, yeah, so the telegrams and the things that they discovered in these messages, these Russian messages, could not be used in court during, when they were trying Julius and Ethel Rosenberg and others. um, it couldn't be used because it was that top secret, and it wasn't revealed. And even when they were older, the woman who was being interviewed for the article was in her, I think, her 90s, and she still had a hard time talking about it because they had taken this oath of secrecy and would, could have been executed for revealing these secrets. So yeah, we have a working title. It's called The Redacted Life of Kat Colleen. I think it's probably going to be changed because they always change my titles.
I really
Um,
like that title, though. I
yeah,
love a quirky title, and that
yeah,
really
it's a
intriguing.
little quirky, but I just handed it in a few weeks ago, so I'll probably be getting edits back soon. And I think that it's a back and forth process probably for the next few months at the
Yeah,
very least. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. So
You're kind of into
that's
phase one of it.
yeah, that's it for a while. This one, because it was a new era of history for me, like not that far from World War II, but
Mm.
it starts in 47. The amount of research was incredible, and it was a tight
Deadline.
timeline.
Forget
Yeah,
about it.
tight deadline, and so it really I was a little burnt out. I'll
Oh,
be honest.
no,
I'm not.
I relate. I totally relate. So
Yeah,
you're probably just decompressing and never wanting to see it again and
yeah,
knowing that
yeah.
it's
I'm like,
coming back to you at some point.
I know I can't even think about like the next book yet. I'm like completely like
No, no.
I don't even. Yeah, I just need
You know
a.
what? I really admire people that can press or write the end and then the next day start the next book. I'm not
Oh,
that person. I
oh
need
my
a
gosh,
depression time just to sort of collapse and rock in a corner until
it's
I
so
feel
intense.
relief.
Yeah,
Yeah, it really is. I mean, all power to you. That sounds amazing. When is it out in 2025? What month?
I think they haven't given me an exact date, but my guess is May, May,
Oh,
June.
okay.
Yeah, yeah. How about you? What's your next thing?
Oh, well, mine's a bit different actually. And it's funny how many parallels there are between us as we're talking, because I have literally just handed in the first draft of my next book and I'm feeling a little somewhat burnt out from it. So this time I'm actually writing a non-fiction this time.
Oh wow.
But it's not it's so basically it's in collaboration with one of Britain's oldest Auschwitz-Birkenau survivors, an amazing lady that I met called Renee Salt, who is 95 now, or nearly 95, and she and her mother survived really from the day one of the invasion of Poland to the liberation of Bergen-Belsen in April 1945, lived through atrocity after atrocity, lost pretty much her whole family were murdered in the Holocaust. And it's just, she is a remarkable woman. She is a survivor and has remained so full of hope and love. And she didn't talk about her experiences for 50 years.
Wow.
Funnily enough, she ended up marrying one of the British liberating soldiers at Bergen-Belsen. She met him in Paris and they found a common bond and they got married and they were deeply in love and had a family for many years. And it's really only after his death that she began to speak the unimaginable. And now, finally, at the end of her life, she's like, I want to write a book. But she felt that she couldn't. So when she said this to me, what could I say? I just sort of was like,
Oh
I'll help
yes.
you. I'll help you. So now it's the first draft is done. It's coming out in England and the States and Canada, I think in February 2025, because next year is the 80th anniversary of the liberation of the camps. And she was in
Hmm.
Auschwitz and she was liberated from Bergen-Belsen. So this book is her way of honoring the memory of her family and finally setting a story down on the page. So it's been harrowing. And I've traveled to Poland and I've traveled to Germany and I've attempted to sort of follow in her footsteps to understand her story and her suffering. And one thing I realized is I might have traveled to the sites of her persecution, but only she stared into the face of the abyss. And it's been my most challenging project that I've ever done.
Oh, I can't
I,
imagine. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
really and truly. Yeah, I think I'm quite looking forward to going back to historical fiction after that because I adore this woman. I've got a very good relationship with her, and we've got a real bond now. But it's been like nothing I've ever worked on. So I'm very nervous to see how it'll be received and
Oh,
whether I've done a good enough job.
well, oh, I'm sure you did, and but it sounds incredibly intense. I mean, that's a very emotional, like
Yeah,
heavy. Yeah, yeah,
it's been incredibly, incredibly emotional, and I can't even I haven't even got the language to describe how I feel about it yet. I
yeah.
think it's still evolving, if I'm honest. I do feel like I'm still slightly traumatized by no, that's not the right no, not traumatized. I can't be traumatized by it, but it's been incredibly tough, you know, and I we spent many, many hours and I've struggled with whether it's the right thing to do in terms of sitting with this woman and all of her pain, asking her and it's very rare to have survived the Holocaust, rarer still at the age of 95 to trawl through your memory for every last little thing that can be remembered. And she's done it. So I'm full of admiration for this
Oh,
woman. So it's going to be,
unbelievable.
yeah, so it's going to be called Do Not Cry When I Die in America. And which was her mother's last words to her. And
Oh,
a mother's promise in the UK. So we'll have to so maybe next year when our respective books come out, we can meet again
I
and
was just thinking
see
that
if
we
we
should
survive the
absolutely.
process.
We'll
That would
do
be
another
wonderful.
we'll do another crossover. There will be no daughters texting and no dogs, and it'll
Yeah,
all be
yeah.
good.
I look forward to it. I'll be more seamless next time.
Exactly. So, Kate, real quick, tell people how they can keep in touch with you, your podcast, and
Ooh.
your contact stuff.
Oh, well, any which way you feel happy to, really. So I'm on Instagram. If you're happy to share in the show notes my social media handles, and I'll share yours. But I check Instagram and Facebook. You can put my email on there as well. Or if you just put From the Library with Love, it's available from wherever you get your podcasts. And if you just put it into Google, it should give you a link to it. And of course, I will put the link up to the show on mine, and then obviously it'll be an identical one to the one that's on yours. But
Awesome.
thank you so much. It hasn't felt like it's just felt like a chat. It's been
I
I've
know.
really enjoyed it. I've loved it actually. So
Me
thank you very
too.
much for having me on
Yeah.
your.
Yeah, this has been so fun, and I will. I'm gonna stop recording in a minute, but thank you everyone for listening, and you have to check out all Kate Thompson's books, and we'll have to do this again in 2025.
Let's check back in next year.
All
Thanks,
right,
Jane.
sounds good. Thank you.